Adventures of Harry Nile.
The fog rolling off Elliott Bay didn't just hide the cargo ships. It hid a multitude of sins. Tonight, I was drowning in both. I sat in the corner booth of the all-night diner. I stared out the grease-smudged window. The Seattle fog was a thick gray wall. It pressed against the glass like a desperate man looking for a warm place to sleep. It clung to the street lamps. It smothered the neon signs. The red electric sign in the diner window was just a fuzzy blur against the dark street. My coffee was lukewarm. My wallet was as empty as a politician's promise. I don't know what time it is where you are right now. I don't know what city you're sitting in while you listen to this case file. Go ahead and drop your local time and town in the comments below. Take a second and let me know. But here in Seattle, it was 1:15 midnight. The city was a ghost town covered in a damp gray shroud. Murphy came around the counter with the coffee pot. She carried it like a weapon. Her hair was locked in a tight, invisible net. Her uniform apron had a fresh stain right near the front pocket. It looked exactly like cherry pie filling, or maybe fresh blood. In this part of town, it was always a 50-50 toss-up. "You gonna buy something solid, Nile?" Murphy asked. Her voice was completely flat. She sounded like a woman who had given up miracles long ago. "Or are you just renting the booth with that 50-cent cup of mud?" she added. "I'm contemplating the universe, Murphy," I said. "Contemplate a slice of meatloaf, honey. You look stiff." She didn't mean it kindly. Her word honey was completely devoid of affection. She was working a double shift at the diner. She had a grandson at home who needed expensive dental braces. She simply didn't have the time or the patience for a busted-down private eye taking up space. "Just top off the mud," I told her. She tipped the glass pot. The dark, bitter liquid splashed into my heavy ceramic mug. "Suit yourself, honey," Murphy said, "but you can't pay your office rent with contemplation." She wasn't wrong. I was running on fumes. I lit a cheap cigarette. I watched the gray smoke drift up and hit the stained ceiling tiles. The diner smelled heavily of fried onions, bleach, and old regret. Then the front door chimed. The small brass bell rattled hard against the glass pane. A gust of freezing wet air blew inside the diner. A woman stepped through the doorway. She absolutely didn't belong in a cheap late-night joint. She had sharp cheekbones. She wore a beautifully tailored dark wool dress. It was too nice for this crumbling neighborhood. It was definitely too nice for a common dockworker's wife. She stopped just inside the door. She smelled like cold rain and expensive floral perfume. The scent fought a losing battle against the heavy smell of frying grease. She looked around the empty room. Her eyes were hard. They were calculating. She didn't look scared. She spotted me sitting in the back corner booth. She walked over. Her expensive shoes clicked loudly on the cheap linoleum floor. The sound was sharp. It sounded like a hammer hitting a metal nail. "Are you Harry Nile?" she asked. Her voice was crisp. It didn't shake, not even a little bit. "Depends entirely on who is asking," I said. I didn't get up from my seat. "My name is Eleanor Finch," she said. "I need a private investigator. The local phone directory said you were cheap and available." "The phone directory is a very harsh critic," I said. I gestured with my cigarette to the empty vinyl seat across from me. "Sit down, Mrs. Finch. Let me guess the plot. Your husband found somebody else. You want me to take dirty photographs for the divorce lawyers." She sat down across from me. She kept her back perfectly straight. She didn't even glance at my lukewarm coffee. "My husband is dead, Mr. Nile," she said. She said it plainly. She said it exactly like she might say it was snowing outside. No crying, no shaking lips. She had the kind of eyes that could calculate a hefty life insurance payout before the body was even cold on the pavement. "I am sorry for your loss," I said. It was an automatic, empty response. I didn't mean it. She didn't care anyway. "Don't be sorry," Eleanor said. "Arthur was a fool. A nervous, detail-oriented little fool. He wore cheap, itchy suits. He always had ink-stained fingers. He worked at the shipping docks. He had grand, stupid ideas. None of them ever paid off." "If Arthur is dead, why do you need me?" I asked. I took a long drag from my cigarette. Thick smoke curled in the air between us. "The police are dragging their feet," she said. "A homicide detective named Russo caught the case tonight. He is incredibly lazy." Russo, thick neck, always chewing a cigar he never actually lights. She had his number exactly right. Russo hated doing actual police work. Russo thinks it was a simple street mugging gone wrong, Eleanor continued. Arthur was out at Pier 19 tonight. Somebody hit him from behind with a heavy metal cargo hook. It crushed his skull. The police patrol found him a few hours ago. A dockside mugging in the heavy fog, I said. It happens every week. What makes you think it wasn't just a random stick-up? Arthur didn't have any money to steal, Eleanor snapped. But he had a life insurance policy, a very large one. I want that money, Mr. Nile. I want it fast. But the insurance company refuses to release the funds until the police officially shut down the murder investigation and sign the paperwork. You want me to light a fire under Detective Russo, I said. I want you to find out exactly what happened so Russo can shut his file, she said. Arthur was a prominent union man. He knew everyone working on those docks. He was killed exactly at 11:15 tonight. I need this mess wrapped up. I stopped moving. My coffee cup hovered halfway to my mouth. 11:15, I repeated slowly. That is a very specific time for a foggy night murder, Mrs. Finch. How do the cops know exactly when the metal hook fell? Eleanor reached into her expensive handbag. She didn't pull out a mourning handkerchief. She pulled out a small leather coin purse. The police told me the time, she said. Arthur always carried a silver pocket watch. He was obsessive about checking the time. The killer struck him hard. He fell onto the wood. Police said his pocket watch was smashed against the wooden pier during physical combat. The glass face shattered. The internal metal hands stopped moving instantly. They froze exactly at 11:15. A smashed pocket watch. It was incredibly neat. It was perfectly tidy. It was almost too helpful. So the killer left a highly convenient timestamp for the cops, I said. I rubbed my jaw. The thick stubble felt rough, like heavy sandpaper. And Russo bought the story. Russo is a simple man, Eleanor said. He likes simple answers. What do you actually think happened? I asked her. Eleanor leaned forward across the Formica table. Her sharp, dark eyes locked onto mine. Arthur was terrified lately, she said softly. He was always checking his union ledgers, sweating over the numbers. I think he found out somebody was stealing from the union. I think he tried to blackmail them. And I think he got his skull caved in for his trouble. You are a very practical widow, Mrs. Finch. I am a desperate widow, Mr. Nile. I have massive debts. I truly hated Arthur. But his death is the only thing that is going to pay my rent this month. Will you take the job or not? She opened her leather coin purse. She pulled out a small, tight roll of cash. It wasn't much money, a few crumpled green bills, mostly 5s and 10s. The bills were soft. They had been folded and unfolded a dozen times. It was desperate money. It was an insult to the detective profession. But a man has got to eat, even if money smells a bit like blood. I reached across the sticky Formica tabletop. I took the crumpled bills directly from her pale hand. I will take a look at Pier 19, I said, before the local cops wash the blood off the dock. Do it fast, Mr. Nile, Eleanor said. She stood up quickly. She smoothed the front of her tailored dress. She didn't bother to say goodbye. She just turned and walked out. The diner bell jingled loudly again. The cold, thick fog swallowed her instantly. Murphy returned to my booth. She looked down at the money in my hand. Looks like you can pay for the coffee after all, Nile, Murphy said. Her tone was completely flat. Leave the whole pot, Murphy, I said. I am going to need it. I dropped a dollar bill on the table. It was slightly more than the coffee cost. Murphy didn't say thank you. She just scooped the money up and shoved it into her stained apron pocket. I finished the lukewarm coffee in one long, terrible swallow. It tasted bitter. It tasted exactly like everything else in this town. I stood up. I pulled my rumpled trench coat tight around my shoulders. I felt the heavy, damp weight of the old fabric. I walked slowly to the glass front door. I was broke. I was completely tired. I was taking direct orders from a widow with ice water running in her veins. I pocketed Eleanor's meager retainer. I pushed the heavy glass door open. I stepped out of the warm diner and directly into the biting dampness of the night. The Seattle fog was waiting for me. The drive down to the waterfront was a slow crawl through a bowl of gray soup. The streetlights along Alaskan Way were just weak, yellow smudges. The air grew colder the closer I got to the water. It smelled intensely of heavy salt, rotting kelp, and damp wood. Pier 19 jutted out into the dark water of Elliott Bay like a rotting wooden finger. A police cruiser sat near the entrance. Its red roof light turned slowly. It sliced through the thick fog like a dull knife. Yellow police tape was strung between a rusty iron bollard and a stack of wooden shipping crates. The tape flapped loosely in the cold sea breeze. A young patrol cop stood by the tape. He stomped his heavy black boots on the wet asphalt to stay warm. He looked miserable. I walked up. I smelled the heavy salt air and the distinct sour odor of cheap tobacco. The cop blew hot air into his cupped hands. "Crime scene is strictly shut down, buddy," the patrolman said. He put a thick, gloved hand on my chest. "Keep walking." "I am walking," I said. I pulled my private investigator license from my coat pocket. I held the leather wallet open under his nose. "Straight in. Detective Russo sent it to me. He needs a consultant who actually knows how to read." The young cop squinted at the license. He didn't care enough to argue. It was too cold to discuss. He lifted the yellow tape. "Suit yourself," the cop muttered. "But watch your step. The wood is extremely slick." I ducked under the tape. My heavy shoes crunched on the gravel, then thudded onto the thick wooden planks of Pier 19. Fog over open water was worse. It muffled every sound. The waves slapped softly against the thick wooden pilings underneath me. Detective Russo was standing near the edge of the pier. He was a large man with a very thick neck. His dark overcoat was completely unbuttoned. He stood over a dark, wet stain on the wooden planks. He was aggressively chewing on a thick, unlit cigar. He rolled the brown leaf from one side of his mouth to the other. He never actually lit the thing. It was just a nervous habit. Russo heard my footsteps. He turned his thick neck slowly. He glared at me. "Who let the garbage in?" Russo asked. His voice was a harsh, raspy bark. "Your patrolman has excellent taste in visitors," I said. I stopped a few feet from the dark spot. "Hello, Russo. The widow Finch sent me. She wants to make sure the city actually earns its tax money tonight." Russo spat a piece of loose tobacco onto the wet wood. "Eleanor Finch is a massive pain in my rear, and so are you, Nile. You are completely trespassing." "I am providing peace of mind to a grieving widow," I said. I shoved my cold hands deep into my trench coat pockets. "She wants the case shut fast. You want the case shut fast. We are practically on the same bowling team. Give me the tour, Russo. What exactly are we looking at here?" Russo ground the unlit cigar between his back teeth. He hated it when I showed up. I made him do actual police work. But he also knew I wouldn't leave until I got a straight story. It was freezing cold. He wanted to get back to a warm precinct desk. "It is a completely standard mugging," Russo grumbled. He pointed a thick, meaty finger at the dark stain on the planks. "Arthur Finch was walking the pier. Somebody jumped him from behind. They hit him with a heavy steel cargo hook. One solid swing, crushed his skull instantly. He dropped right here." I looked at the dark spot. It was blood. A large amount of it. The damp sea air kept it from drying. "Where is the cargo hook?" I asked. "Right over there," Russo said. He pointed toward a stack of wooden shipping pallets. "The killer threw the metal hook down and ran. We already tagged it. It is heavily covered in blood. No fingerprints, of course. The killer wore thick work gloves, standard dockworker gear." "Why was Finch out here at 11:15 at night?" I asked. "He worked in a union office. He was a numbers guy. He didn't load heavy freight." "Maybe he was meeting a friend," Russo said. He shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Maybe he just liked the smell of dead fish. It doesn't matter. Some local dock rats saw his expensive wool coat. They decided to crack his head and rob him. Case closed." "Except they didn't actually rob him," I pointed out. "His widow told me he still had his silver pocket watch. The killer didn't take the silver." Russo scowled. He hated when the details didn't perfectly match his lazy theories. "The killer got totally spooked," Russo insisted. He stepped closer to me. He tried to use his massive size to intimidate me. It didn't work. I had been threatened by better men. "The killer hit Finch. Finch fell down hard. His silver pocket watch smashed directly against the wooden pier. The loud crash probably scared the mugger away before they could check his pockets. The night watchman was patrolling the next dock. He heard the loud struggle. The guard ran, but the fog was extremely thick. The killer vanished, and the watch stopped precisely at 11:15, I said softly. "Exactly," Russo said. He sounded triumphant. "The glass shattered, the metal hands jammed tight. We have the absolute exact time of death." The coroner already came and removed the body. We just need to hose down the blood. Now get off my crime scene, Nile. Tell the grieving widow I will sign the final paperwork tomorrow morning." Russo turned his back to me. He walked a few steps away to yell at a uniformed cop who was holding a heavy flashlight incorrectly. I didn't leave. I stayed entirely quiet. I walked slowly around the dark bloodstain. Something felt completely wrong. The air felt too clean. A simple dock rat doesn't leave a silver watch behind. I stepped toward the edge of the pier. There was a row of large empty metal oil drums. The dock workers used them as trash cans to burn scrap wood during the winter. I stood next to one of the rusty green drums. I looked inside. The drum was mostly empty. It contained a few damp ashes and some crumpled wax paper. But a strange, sharp scent drifted up from the rusted metal bottom. It didn't smell like burning scrap wood. It smelled exactly like gunpowder, mixed with cheap burnt tobacco. That made absolutely no sense. Russo said the weapon was a heavy cargo hook. Nobody fired a gun tonight. The night watchman only heard a struggle, not a gunshot. I casually leaned over the metal rim. I kept my back strictly turned toward Detective Russo. I blocked his line of sight with my heavy trench coat. I reached my right arm deep inside the rusty oil drum. My fingers brushed against the damp, cold metal bottom. I touched something small. It was small and slightly melted. I grabbed it. I pulled my hand out quickly and slipped the item directly into my coat pocket. I turned away from the metal drum. I kept my hands casually in my pockets. My fingers traced the outline of the item I had just stolen from the crime scene. It was a cardboard matchbook, but it was strangely thick. The cardboard was severely scorched. The edges were weirdly melted. A normal dropped matchbook doesn't melt like that. It only melts like that if it gets extremely hot, extremely fast. Russo finished yelling at the young patrolman. He turned to face me. He chewed angrily on his cigar. "Are you still standing here, Nile?" Russo barked. "I was just enjoying the lovely sea breeze, Russo," I said. I gave him a very thin, totally fake smile. "I will tell Mrs. Finch that you are doing an absolutely stellar job." Russo grunted in deep annoyance. He waved his thick hand, dismissing me entirely. I turned my back on the detective. I walked slowly away from the bloodstain. I ducked under the flapping yellow police tape. My shoes crunched loudly on the gravel as I walked away from the heavy wooden planks. My right hand stayed buried deep in my coat pocket. My thumb rubbed the rough, heavily scorched cardboard of the stolen matchbook. A simple dockside mugging doesn't smell like burnt gunpowder. A heavy cargo hook doesn't leave a melted cardboard matchbook hidden inside an empty metal oil drum. Detective Russo was completely wrong. The streets always talk if you know exactly how to listen. And tonight, this pier was screaming out a totally different story. I walked into the freezing fog, clutching the melted cardboard tightly in my fist. The address on the crumpled slip of paper in my pocket led me to a run-down rooming house on 2nd Avenue. The building looked like it had been built around the time Seattle was still a muddy logging camp. The wood door paint was peeling off dry, gray flakes. A single flickering overhead bulb in the hallway cast a sickly yellow glow over the water-stained wallpaper. I climbed the creaking wooden stairs. Every step I took sounded like a pistol shot in the silent hallway. I found room 2B. I raised my right hand and knocked sharply on the wood. 2 hard raps. A heavy bolt slid back inside. The door opened a few inches. A security chain stayed locked tight across the frame. A man peered at me through the narrow gap. He had slicked black hair that looked like it had been greased down with industrial engine oil. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. They darted nervously back and forth, never staying still for more than a second. His skin had the pale, pasty look of a man who worked the night shift and slept in a room with the heavy curtains permanently drawn. He wore a rumpled white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. On his left wrist, he wore a heavy gold wristwatch. He kept tapping the metal casing of the watch with his right index finger. A nervous habit. A very bad habit. "What do you want?" the man asked. His voice was high and tight. It sounded like a guitar string pulled way too close to snapping. "Tommy Mercer," I asked. The man flinched slightly at his own name. He tried to force a confident, casual smile onto his pale face, but his mouth twitched all wrong. "Depends on who is asking," Tommy said. "I didn't order any milk, and I certainly didn't order any company this late." "My name is Nile," I said. I pulled my coat back just enough for him to catch a quick glimpse of the lining. "I am a private investigator. I am looking into the unfortunate accident that happened to Artie Finch down at Pier 19 tonight." Tommy's face went completely bloodless. Pale skin turned the color of old chalk. He swallowed hard. I could see Adam's apple bob sharply up and down in his thin throat. "Artie?" Tommy whispered. He gripped the edge of the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned pure white. "What do you mean, accident? Artie didn't have accidents. Artie was extremely careful. He was a numbers man." "Well, the numbers finally caught up with him," I said. "Somebody cracked his skull open with a cargo hook. The cops are calling it a random mugging, but I like to check things out for myself. Can I come in, Tommy? Or do we have to discuss a dead man out here in the drafty hallway?" Tommy hesitated. His dark, panicked eyes looked down the empty hallway, checking for ghosts. Then he looked back at me. He realized standing here arguing with a private eye in an open doorway was drawing entirely too much attention. He slammed the door shut. The metal chain rattled hard. A second later, the chain slid off its track. The door swung wide open. "Get inside," Tommy muttered. "Before the landlord starts complaining." I passed him in the tiny room. It smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, and cheap shaving lotion. The air was entirely too warm. A small electric heater glowed bright red in the corner, humming softly against the baseboard. A single unshaded overhead light bulb hung from a frayed cord, swinging slightly from the draft of the open door. Tommy backed away from me. He wiped his sweaty palms down the front of his trousers. He looked like a man standing on a very thin sheet of ice over a deep, freezing lake. "I didn't have anything to do with Artie," Tommy said immediately. He didn't wait for me to accuse him. That was his first major mistake. A truly innocent man asks what happened first. A guilty man starts defending himself before you even finish the sentence. "We were friends. Sort of. We worked in the union office together. But I haven't seen Arthur in days. Not a single day." "Who said anything about you being there, Tommy?" I asked softly. I walked slowly across the cheap rug. I pulled a wooden chair away from a small table and sat uninvited. "You are getting awfully defensive for a guy who just learned his friend had an accident." Tommy approached a small wooden dresser. He took a pack of cigarettes with shaking fingers. He tried to light one with a heavy metal lighter, but his thumb slipped twice against the flint. A tiny spark popped, but the wick didn't catch. Cursing under his breath, he finally managed to drag a weak flame. He took a deep, shaky drag. The glowing red tip of the cigarette trembled violently between his stained fingers. "I'm not defensive," Tommy lied. His voice cracked slightly on the word. He exhaled a thick cloud of blue-gray smoke toward the ceiling. "I'm just shocked. Artie was a quiet guy. He kept his head down. Who would want to hurt him?" "According to his widow, Arthur was worried about something," I said. I leaned back in the wooden chair. I watched him closely. He was sweating over the union books. He thought money was out the door, money that didn't belong to the workers. Tommy's right hand twitched. The heavy gold wristwatch on his wrist caught the harsh glare of the overhead bulb, flashing a bright spark of yellow light into my eyes. He instinctively pulled his arm back, shoving his hand deep into his trouser pocket. "Artie imagined things," Tommy said. He forced a harsh, nervous laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "The union is completely clean. Silas Croft runs a tight ship there. Everybody knows that. If Artie was seeing ghosts in the ledger, that's his own fault." "Maybe," I said. "Where were you tonight around 11:15, Tommy?" Tommy didn't even blink. He had clearly rehearsed this exact question in his head a dozen times before I ever knocked on his door. "I was nowhere near the docks," Tommy said smoothly, too smoothly. "I spent the entire evening downtown. I went to a movie at the Orpheum Theater. Then I caught a late bite to eat at a diner on Union Street. I was nowhere near Pier 19. "That is a very specific alibi for a guy who just heard about a murder," I noted. "I'm telling you the exact truth," Tommy snapped. He pulled his hand from his pocket. This time he was holding a small, crumpled piece of paper. It looked like a standard receipt from a cash register. He practically shoved the paper into my face. "Look at this. Read it. It's a yellow cab receipt, time-stamped and printed directly by the driver's machine. Look at the exact time." I took the small piece of paper from his trembling hand. I held it up to the harsh light of the overhead bulb. The ink was a crisp, clear purple. "Yellow Cab Company, Seattle. Date, tonight. Time, 11:15 p.m. sharp." It was stamped right there in plain black and purple ink. 11:15. Exactly the same minute the silver pocket watch smashed against the wooden planks of Pier 19. I flagged the cab right outside the diner on Union Street, Tommy said. He was talking fast now, eager to pile the details on top of each other. The driver dropped me off right outside this exact rooming house at 11:30. Ask the driver. He's got my fare in his logbook. I was miles away from the waterfront when poor Arthur took his dirt nap. I stared at the crisp paper receipt. It was completely pristine. It was ironclad. It was an airtight, bulletproof alibi. A man cannot smash a pocket watch on a dark wooden pier at 11:15 if he is sitting inside a moving taxicab across town at that exact same minute. The math didn't just fail. It was physically impossible. Tommy watched me read the receipt. A tiny wave of arrogant relief washed over his pale, sweaty face. He thought he had just handed me a get-out-of-jail-free card. He thought he had completely checkmated a private investigator with a scrap of purple ink. "Well?" Tommy asked. A faint, ugly smirk touched the corner of his thin mouth. "Does that clear up my evening for you, Mr. Nile?" I carefully folded the cab receipt. I slid it into my vest pocket. "It clears you of murder, Tommy," I said slowly. I rose from the wooden chair. I buttoned my heavy trench coat against the ambient heat of the electric room heater. An ironclad alibi is a wonderful thing to own in this town. It keeps a man sleeping very soundly. "Damn right it does," Tommy said. His voice regained a little bit of its false bravado. He tapped his heavy gold watch again with his index finger. "Now, if you're quite finished harassing a grieving colleague of poor Arthur, I'd like to get back to my evening." "Sleep tight, Tommy," I told him. "Just remember to keep your doors bolted. The fog in this city has a nasty habit of creeping into places it doesn't belong." I turned my back on him. I walked across the room, opened the door, and stepped back out into the dimly lit, water-stained hallway. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The lock clicked firmly into place. I walked down the creaking wooden stairs and pushed my way out onto the wet Seattle pavement. The night air hit my face like a splash of ice water. Tommy Mercer had a pristine cab receipt. He had a timestamp that matched the smashed pocket watch down to the exact second. Everything lined up far too neatly. It fit together like pieces in a child's puzzle. And in my line of work, when a puzzle fits together that perfectly, it usually means somebody spent a lot of time trimming the edges with a very sharp pair of scissors. I pulled my collar up against the damp chill. I walked down 2nd Avenue, chewing on the cold reality of the case. Tommy Mercer had an airtight alibi for 11:15, which meant he had plenty of time to set the stage before he ever climbed into that cab. The walk back to Eleanor Finch's house was a long, cold trudge through the dripping shadows of the residential blocks. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, heavy mist that clung to the hedges and turned the street lamps into blurry halos of weak yellow light. By the time I climbed the short flight of concrete steps to her front porch, my boots felt soaked through and my lungs tasted like damp wood smoke. I knocked twice on the dark wood door. I didn't have to wait long. The lock clicked instantly, as if she had been standing right behind the wood waiting for my return. The door swung open. Eleanor stood in the doorway, wearing the exact same dark dress she had worn at the diner. Her dark hair was neatly pinned. She didn't look like a woman mourning a husband of 10 years. She looked like a businesswoman waiting to sign a final contract. "You are back quickly, Mr. Nile," Eleanor said. Her voice was cool, level, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Does Detective Russo finally have his paperwork ready to sign?" "Russo is still chasing ghosts in the fog," I said, stepping past her into the small, overly tidy entryway without waiting for an invitation. "And I'm chasing something more interesting. Mind if I come in out of the damp?" She closed the front door behind me. The latch clicked shut with a sharp, metallic snap. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and cedarwood. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no framed photographs of Arthur Finch on the mantelpiece. No signs that a human being with ink-stained fingers had ever lived and breathed within these four walls. "Make it quick, Mr. Nile," Eleanor said, walking briskly into the small living room. She gestured toward a floral-patterned armchair with a sweep of her hand, but she didn't sit down herself. She remained standing by the unlit fireplace, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I have a lot of calls to make to the insurance agency in the morning. I need to know when I can get my life insurance payout. I didn't take the armchair. Instead, I stood near the center of the rug, pulling a crumpled cigarette from my pocket and rolling it between my fingers. I didn't light it. In a house this clean, lighting a cigarette felt like tracking mud across a clean kitchen floor. "You're in an awful hurry to cash out, Mrs. Finch," I said, keeping my eyes locked on her sharp face. "Most widows take at least a day or two to pretend to cry. You act like you just won a ticket at the local raffle." Eleanor's dark eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't flinch. She didn't drop her gaze or look away. She met my stare with a cold, hardened defiance. "Arthur and I had an arrangement," she said flatly. "We were married out of convenience, Mr. Nile, not out of some cheap Hollywood romance." He was a dull, nervous little man who spent every evening hunched over heavy ledger books, muttering about numbers that didn't add up. He gave me a roof over my head and a meager allowance. Now that he is gone, I want the financial security he promised me. Is there a crime in wanting to move on with my life? "Depends on how the money moved before he died," I said. I took a slow step closer to her. Arthur wasn't just a quiet clerk. He was tracking something heavy at the union office, something that made him very nervous, and something that apparently got his skull crushed open on Pier 19. For a split second, a flash of genuine emotion crossed Eleanor's face. It wasn't grief, it wasn't sorrow. It was a sharp, biting irritation. She uncrossed her arms and let her hands drop to her sides. "Arthur was a coward," she snapped, her voice rising just a fraction of an octave. "He spent his entire life worrying about everyone else's business instead of his own bank account. If he found out somebody was stealing from the union, he should have kept his mouth shut and taken a cut like everyone else with half a brain. Instead, he worried himself straight into an early grave." I watched her closely. I watched as her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. I watched as her eyes tracked my movements without a shred of genuine fear. She was greedy, she was cold, she was entirely pragmatic. But as I stood there in her quiet, sterile living room, watching the steady rise and fall of her breath, I realized something important. Eleanor Finch wasn't a murderer. She didn't have the stomach for blood, let alone the mechanical precision required to stage a dockside execution in the thick Seattle fog. She wanted Arthur dead because he was an anchor dragging her down, but she didn't lift the cargo hook herself. She was genuinely in the dark about where the missing union funds had gone, because Arthur never shared his secrets with a wife he considered a liability. "You didn't know about the missing money, did you?" I asked softly. Eleanor paused. She looked at me, her sharp jaw tightening. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't have to. The silence in the room gave her away entirely. "Arthur kept his work at the docks," she finally said, her voice dropping back to its cold, measured baseline. "He didn't trust me with his little secrets, and I didn't care enough to ask. If he was playing a dangerous game down at the waterfront, he played it alone." "Yeah," I muttered, sliding the unlit cigarette back into my pocket. "He played it alone, all right, right up until the moment somebody hit him from behind." I turned my back on her and walked over to a small mahogany desk sitting against the far wall of the living room. It was neat. Pencils were lined up. A small ceramic tray held a collection of paper clips. "Don't touch his things," Eleanor warned sharply, her footsteps clicking on the hardwood floor as she took a step toward me. "I'm not touching anything, Mrs. Finch," I said, keeping my hands resting casually in my trench coat pockets. I leaned down slightly, peering at the top surface of the desk. I'm just admiring the tidiness. Arthur was a very organized man, everything in its proper place, every number accounted for. "He was a clerk," she said dismissively, stopping a few feet behind me. "Order was the only thing he was ever good at." I didn't say anything else. I turned around and faced her. The air between us felt heavy, charged with a mutual distrust that was as thick as the fog outside on the street. "You'll get your insurance money, Mrs. Finch," I told her, walking past her toward the front entryway. "Just as soon as Detective Russo finishes his paperwork. But until then, I'd keep your doors bolted. The people Arthur worked with down at the docks don't like loose ends, and right now, you're looking like a very loose end." Eleanor didn't flinch at the warning. She followed me to the door, her face as hard and smooth as a polished stone. "Just make sure Russo signs the papers, Mr. Nile," she said, her hand resting on the brass doorknob. "That is what I paid you for. The rest of it is just noise." "Noise is my specialty," I said. She pulled the front door open. The cold, damp night air rushed into the warm hallway, carrying the distant smell of salt water and wet pavement. I stepped past her, out onto the porch, and pulled my collar up against the chill. Behind me the door clicked. The heavy lock slid into place with a definitive metallic thud. I walked down the concrete steps and back out onto the dark Seattle sidewalk. Eleanor Finch was greedy, but she wasn't the killer. She was just another bystander awaiting a payout in a city full of broken promises. The real answer wasn't sitting in a quiet, tidy living room on a residential street. It was waiting down at the union office, buried under layers of cooked books, missing ledgers, and men who knew how to cover their tracks. I shoved my hands deep into my pockets, feeling the rough edge of the scorched matchbook, and started walking back toward the dim lights of the avenue. I walked back through the swinging glass door of the all-night diner. The place smelled exactly as it had hours ago: stale grease, cheap bleach, and old coffee grounds. The red neon sign in the front window flickered softly, casting a bleeding pink light across the wet linoleum floor. Murphy was standing behind the counter. She was wiping down the formica surface with a gray, damp rag. She didn't look up when the door chimed, but she knew the exact sound of my boots. "Back again, Nile?" Murphy asked. Her voice was as flat as a discarded pancake. "Did the rich widow throw you out into the street? Did you finally realize you can't pay your tab with charm?" "The widow is doing just fine, Murphy," I said, walking over to my old corner booth. I slid into the vinyl seat and dropped my heavy trench coat onto the empty chair beside me. "She's practically measuring the drapes for her new apartment, but the case itself is about as crooked as a $3 bill." Murphy walked with a glass coffee pot. She didn't ask if I wanted a refill. She just poured a fresh stream of the dark, bitter mud into my heavy ceramic mug until it was dangerously close to spilling over the rim. "You look like a man trying to swallow a dry fish bone," Murphy said. She set the pot down with a dull thud. "Drink your mud and quit scowling at my counter. You're scaring the salt shaker." "I'm looking at a mathematical impossibility, Murphy," I muttered, pulling a set of crumpled notes and the stolen coroner's report from my vest pocket. I spread the papers out across the sticky table under the harsh glare of the ceiling light. "And in my line of work, when the math doesn't add up, somebody is cooking the books." Murphy paused with her gray rag in her hand. She looked down at my papers, her tired eyes narrowing just a fraction. "What kind of math are we talking about, honey?" she asked. The word was completely devoid of warmth, but there was a sharp, street-smart curiosity hiding underneath her flat tone. "The kind that stops a clock at exactly 11:15, I said, tapping my index finger against the coroner's notes. I leaned back against the vinyl booth and took a long, bitter swallow of the coffee. The liquid burned my throat, but it cleared my head. I looked down at the physical details of the murder scene once more, turning them over in my mind like loose gear in a broken watch. Detective Russo was entirely satisfied with the police narrative. A dock worker jumps into the thick fog at Pier 19. He gets hit from behind with a heavy steel cargo hook. He falls hard against the wooden planks. His silver pocket watch shatters against the rough timber, jamming the metal hands tight at 11:15. The night watchman hears the struggle and comes running, but the killer vanishes into the gray soup of the Seattle night. It is neat, it is tidy. It fits neatly into a standard police report that lets Russo close the file before lunch tomorrow. Except one glaring, impossible detail. The exact same minute that Silver Pocket Watch was allegedly shattering against the wooden pier at Pier 19, 11:15 sharp, Tommy Mercer was sitting comfortably in the back of a moving taxicab miles away across town. The yellow cab receipt in my pocket proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The driver's ink stamp was crisp. The timestamp was locked in. Tommy had an airtight, bulletproof alibi for 11:15. A man cannot be in two places at once. He cannot be swinging a heavy cargo hook down on a dark waterfront pier while simultaneously riding in a commercial vehicle on Union Street. "You look like you just figured out the butler didn't do it," Murphy noted, leaning her hip against the edge of the counter and crossing her arms over her apron. "The butler didn't just avoid doing it, Murphy," I said softly, staring into the dark surface of my coffee mug. "The whole crime scene was built like a theatrical stage play." "A play?" Murphy asked, her eyebrows arching slightly. "Think about it," I said, leaning forward across the table. What is the very first thing a lazy cop looks at when he finds a dead body with a broken watch? He looks at the hands. He takes the time of death right off the dial. It's an easy shortcut. It saves the coroner from having to dig too deep into stomach contents and body temperatures. People break watches when they fall, Murphy said pragmatically. I dropped a saucer on this floor last Tuesday and smashed it to pieces. Accidents happen, Nile. Accidents happen, I agreed. But smashed pocket watches left right at the exact moment of a murder. That is a very old, very tired Hollywood cliché. It's a neon sign built specifically to catch a lazy detective's eye. I pulled the coroner's report closer and traced the line describing the victim's personal effects. Arthur Finch was a nervous, detail-oriented man. He wore cheap wool suits. He had ink-stained fingers. He was a numbers clerk who spent his entire life making sure every decimal point landed exactly where it belonged. Would a meticulous, careful man like Arthur Finch walk around with an unprotected silver pocket watch dangling loosely in a pocket where it could easily be smashed to pieces during a common mugging? Or did somebody else take that watch out of his dead pocket after the breath was already gone, smash the glass face against the wood on purpose, and manually jam the hands to a very specific, pre-arranged time? The pieces began to click together in my head with a cold, hard snap. The smashed pocket watch wasn't a casualty of a violent struggle. It was a prop. It was a manufactured alibi marker designed to lie to the police. It was planted to anchor the official time of death securely to 11:15. And why 11:15? Because 11:15 was the exact moment Tommy Mercer needed to be miles away, establishing his ironclad taxicab alibi. You're saying the watch was faked, Murphy stated flatly, reading the sharp expression on my face. I'm saying the watch was a setup, I said. I tapped the paper again. The killer didn't smash it during the fight. The killer killed Arthur earlier, long before 11:15. Then the killer staged the body, broke the glass face, jammed the hands to match a future timestamp, and walked away. Or rather, rode away in a yellow cab. That's a pretty big trick, Murphy said, her voice dropping a register. If the murder happened earlier, what made the night watchman hear a struggle and find the body right at 11:15? Dead men don't yell for help. They don't, I agreed, unless somebody else makes the noise for them. My hand instinctively drifted inside my heavy trenchcoat pocket. My fingertips brushed against the rough, heavily scorched cardboard of the melted matchbook I had stolen from the rusty oil drum down at Pier 19. A matchbook. A delayed fuse, a blank cartridge or a loud firecracker muffled inside an empty metal oil drum to echo across the water like a gunshot, or a sudden violent struggle just as the watchman made his rounds. It was brilliantly simple, and it meant the entire timeline constructed by Detective Russo was absolute fiction. I looked across the counter at Murphy. She was watching me with a steady, unblinking gaze. She had seen enough broken men walk through those diner doors over the decades to know when a private investigator was staring right into the jaws of a dangerous truth. You look like you just swallowed a live frog, Nile, Murphy said quietly. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to check the books, Murphy, I said, standing up from the booth and pulling my rumpled trench coat tight around my shoulders. I tossed a couple of silver coins onto the Formica table to cover the coffee and the conversation. Arthur Finch was tracking missing money in the Union Ledger, and his best friend Tommy Mercer is wearing an expensive gold wristwatch that doesn't match a dockworker's salary. Watch your step out there, honey, Murphy said, her flat tone carrying a rare hint of genuine warning. The fog out tonight is thick enough to choke a dog. The fog is the only honest thing left in this city, I told her. I turned away from the counter and pushed my way back out the front door. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of salt and rain. The timeline didn't hold. The watch was a lie, and I was finally holding the right thread to pull the whole ugly sweater apart. The offices of the Waterfront Shipping Union sat at the end of a narrow cobblestone alleyway just 3 blocks off the main drag of Alaskan Way. A faded wooden sign hung over the heavy oak door, swaying slightly in the drafty sea breeze. The words painted on the wood were peeling away in yellowish flakes. Seattle Dock Workers Mutual Association, Local 42. A single dim bulb burned behind the front office's frosted glass window. It cast a sickly, jaundiced square of light onto the wet stone steps outside. I didn't bother knocking. I reached out, gripped the cold brass door handle and twisted. The heavy wood swung open with a dry, protesting creak. The interior smelled intensely of cheap cigar smoke, stale machine oil, and old paper. The front room was entirely empty, cluttered with rows of empty wooden chairs and a bulletin board covered in faded safety notices. A second door at the back of the room led to the inner office. That door was propped open a few inches, leaking a thick blue stream of cigarette smoke into the quiet hallway. I walked across the scuffed linoleum floor, keeping my footsteps light. I pushed the inner door open with the flat of my hand and stepped inside. Silas Croft sat behind a massive, executive-sized mahogany desk that looked like it had been salvaged from the captain's quarters of a sunken steamship. Croft was a mountain of a man, built like an iron freight train, with shoulders that strained the seams of his expensive gray wool suit. A thick silk necktie was knotted tightly beneath his thick neck, held in place by a heavy gold pin. He didn't look up immediately when I walked in. He was slowly turning a heavy silver paper knife over and over in his massive square-fingered hands. Two men stood quietly in the shadows near the filing cabinets. They wore cheap suits that didn't quite hide the heavy bulges of shoulder holsters beneath their left arms. They didn't say a word, but their eyes locked onto me the second I crossed the threshold. They looked like the kind of muscle you hire when you want a problem permanently removed from a balance sheet. "Close the door, mister," Croft said. His voice was a low, grinding rumble, like heavy gravel sliding down the metal bed of a dump truck. Drafts give me terrible stiffness in the neck. I reached back, pulled the heavy inner door shut until the latch clicked, and walked the rest of the way into the room. I stopped about 6 feet from his mahogany desk. I didn't sit down. I didn't want to get comfortable in a room where the furniture looked like it had been designed for interrogations. "I'm allergic to drafts myself, Croft," I said, keeping my hands resting casually in the deep pockets of my trench coat, "especially the kind that blows in off Elliott Bay with a cargo hook attached to them." Croft finally stopped turning the silver paper knife. He deliberately placed it on a leather blotter. He raised his heavy head. His small, dark eyes studied me with the cold, calculating detachment of a butcher inspecting a side of beef. "You're that gumshoe, Nile," Croft said. It wasn't a question. It was a flat, dismissive statement of fact. "Detective Russo mentioned you were sniffing around the docks like a stray dog looking for table scraps. I thought I made it clear to the local cops that this union runs its own house." "Russo is easily distracted," I said. "He likes tidy little stories with smashed clocks and convenient timestamps. But I have a bad habit of looking past the clock hands to see who actually wound the spring." Croft leaned back in his leather swivel chair. The springs groaned loudly under his massive weight. He reached into an open cedar box on his desk, pulled out a long dark cigar, and bit the end off with his back teeth. He didn't light it right away. He just rolled it between his thick lips, eyeing me with an expression that combined deep boredom with latent violence. "Arthur Finch was a clerk," Croft said slowly, his voice dropping an octave. He pushed numbers around on paper. He filed union dues, tracked the shipping manifests, and went home to his quiet house every single evening. He was as dangerous as a wet kitten. "Why are you dragging his ghost into my office, Nile?" "Arthur wasn't just pushing numbers, Croft," I said, stepping a little closer to the edge of the mahogany desk. "He was keeping track of where the cash was leaking, and someone down here was drilling holes right through the bottom of the union's barrel." Croft's dark eyes narrowed. The two men standing by the filing cabinets shifted their weight slightly. A floorboard groaned under a sudden boot heel. The tension in the room tightened like a piano wire pulled a half-turn past the snapping point. "Are you accusing this association of something, mister?" Croft asked, his voice hardening into a jagged edge. "Because that is a very dangerous habit to have in a town where the water is deep and the current runs fast." "I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet," I said smoothly. "I'm just pointing out a very simple arithmetic problem. Arthur Finch spent the last 3 weeks of his life sweating over his ledgers. He found a discrepancy, a big one, thousands of dollars in missing union dues that didn't match the shipping manifests. Somebody was bleeding the fund dry, Croft, and it wasn't the rank-and-file dock workers." Croft didn't blink. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a heavy gold match striker, and finally flicked a flame to his dark cigar. He took a long, slow drag, drawing the thick blue smoke deep into his chest before exhaling it in a lazy cloud toward the ceiling. "Every organization has expenses, Nile," Croft said through the smoke. "Paper costs money. Storage costs money. Crane maintenance at Pier 19 isn't cheap." Arthur was a nervous little bean counter who didn't understand the broader picture of waterfront economics. He understood numbers well enough to know when pages were missing, I said. Croft froze. The cigar hovered an inch from his mouth. For the first time since I walked into the room, the absolute calm on his heavy face cracked just a fraction. "What did you say?" Croft asked softly. "I said missing pages," I repeated, holding his hard gaze without flinching. Arthur kept a secondary record at home, a private ledger locked in his desk drawer. He knew the official books here had been changed. He knew somebody went through his office files and ripped out the receipts that proved where the money went. Croft slowly lowered his cigar. He leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the polished mahogany surface of the desk. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked dangerous. "You think I'm worried about a missing page, Nile?" Croft muttered, his voice like grinding stones. "You think I'd get my hands dirty over a couple of grand in union dues? I run this entire waterfront. Every crane, every ship, every container that moves through Seattle passes through my hands. Petty cash theft is for street thugs, not men like me." "Then who was doing it, Croft?" I asked. "Who had access to the books every single night? Who worked closely enough with Arthur to know which pages to doctor and which ones to tear out?" Croft stared at me for a long, silent moment. The only sound in the room was the low, steady hum of the electric wall clock ticking away the seconds, and the distant slap of gray water against the wooden pilings outside. Slowly, deliberately, Croft reached out his right hand. He pulled open the top center drawer of his heavy mahogany desk. He didn't pull a revolver. He didn't pull out a pair of brass knuckles. Instead, he reached inside and lifted a thick, leather-bound ledger book. He slid it across the smooth wood of the desk until it stopped right in front of me, resting near the edge. "Take a look at it, Gumshoe," Croft said, his voice flat and uncompromising. "See for yourself what Arthur was looking at before he went out for his late-night walk." I didn't touch the book immediately. I kept my hands in my coat pockets, my eyes scanning Croft's face for a trap. When I saw none, I stepped forward and looked down at the open pages of the ledger. The handwriting was neat, precise, and completely obsessive. Arthur Finch's unmistakable work, column after column of numbers detailing union dues, administrative costs, and shipping disbursements. But as my eyes scanned down the right-hand margin of the central page, I saw it. A stark, glaring discrepancy. A massive block of funds marked special maintenance, totaling several $1,000s, sitting completely unsupported by any corresponding work orders or equipment purchases. And right across the bottom margin of the page, where the ink should have been crisp and clean, there was a heavy, deliberate smudge. A dark smear of wet ink where someone had tried to hastily blot out an initial or a signature before the page could dry. The paper fibers were slightly torn, as if a pen had been jammed into the grain in a sudden moment of panic or rush. I leaned down a fraction of an inch, squinting through the dim overhead light at the smudged ink. The handwriting beneath the smear wasn't Silas Croft's heavy, sprawling block letters. It was smaller, cramped, and nervous. The exact handwriting of a man who spent his nights sweating over numbers in a cheap rooming house on 2nd Avenue. Or a man who wore an expensive gold wristwatch he couldn't possibly afford on a standard union clerk's salary. The ledger smudge didn't point to Silas Croft. Croft was a brute, but he was a legitimate boss running an open-air racket. He didn't need to sneak around ripping pages out of his own books. The thief was someone working right inside the office, someone Arthur trusted, someone who had access to the books, the accounts, and the victim's personal confidence. I slowly raised my head and looked back across the desk at Silas Croft. "Well, Nile?" Croft asked, blowing another thick cloud of cigar smoke toward the ceiling. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I found the leak, Croft," I said quietly, my hand sliding a little deeper into my coat pocket, brushing against the rough, scorched edge of the matchbook. "And it smells a lot closer to home than you think." Croft grunted, leaning back in his swivel chair and picking up his silver paper knife once more. "Get out of my office, Nile," Croft said, his voice dropping back into its low, grinding rumble. "Take your theories and your crumpled trench coat and get off my docks. And if you talk to Detective Russo, tell him the union books are completely balanced, because if you don't, These two gentlemen by the filing cabinets are going to help you find a very permanent way home." I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. I had seen the ledger smudge. I had seen the frantic smudged ink of a man who was stealing blind behind his employer's back and running out of time to cover his tracks. I turned my back on Silas Croft and his two silent shadows. I walked across the scuffed linoleum floor, pulled the heavy oak door open, and stepped out into the damp, chill air of the cobblestone alleyway. The puzzle was finally coming together. Arthur Finch hadn't been killed by a random dockside mugger looking for a wallet. He had been silenced by his best friend, a man with expensive tastes, mounting gambling debts, a pristine taxicab receipt, and a heavy gold watch that ticked away the seconds to a very carefully manufactured murder. I walked back down to Pier 19 alone. The fog had rolled in thicker this time, swallowing the wooden pilings and turning the dark water of Elliott Bay into a flat, mirror-like sheet of liquid graphite. The police tape was gone, stripped away by Rousseau's men earlier in the day, leaving the damp wooden planks quiet and completely deserted. My boots made a hollow, echoing thud against the timber as I made my way out toward the end of the pier. The salty chill bit straight through my trench coat, but I didn't care. I needed to see the space with my own eyes. I needed to test the mechanics of a murder that had been engineered down to the exact second. I stopped near the edge of the dark, rain-washed bloodstain where Arthur Finch had supposedly fallen. Just a few feet away sat the row of empty metal oil drums, the same rusty green containers the dock workers used to burn scrap wood during the bitter winter nights. I stepped up to the open drum where I had found the scorched matchbook earlier. I leaned my weight against the rusted metal rim and looked down into the dark, ash-filled interior. The physical mechanics of the crime were spinning around in my head like the gears of a broken clock. Detective Rousseau had bought the official story without a second thought. A violent struggle, a smashed pocket watch, an 11:15 p.m. time of death, and an open and shut case of a botched robbery. But a pocket watch doesn't smash itself, and a dead man doesn't fire a gun from the grave. Or rather, the gun hadn't been fired at all. I reached deep into my coat pocket and pulled out the piece of evidence I had pocketed during my first visit to the crime scene, the thick, heavily scorched cardboard matchbook. I turned it over in my fingers under the faint, watery glow of a distant harbor light. The edges were warped and curled inward. The striking strip was completely blackened. It wasn't burned by a normal, casual flame. It had been subjected to a concentrated, slow-burning heat source, the kind you get when you wrap a lit cigarette tightly around the base of a matchbook using a rubber band or a piece of twine, creating a primitive, highly reliable mechanical time delay fuse. I traced the sequence in my mind, walking through the physical steps of the killer's setup. First, Tommy Mercer lured Arthur Finch down to this dark, isolated pier well before 11 o'clock at night. They argued over the missing union funds, the ledger discrepancies, and Tommy's mounting gambling debts. When Arthur threatened to expose the theft to Silas Croft or the authorities, Tommy struck him from behind with a heavy steel cargo hook. One brutal, unyielding blow that crushed Arthur's skull instantly, dropping him silently onto the wooden planks. The murder happened early, hours before 11:15, which left Tommy with a massive logistical problem. If the body was discovered at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, Tommy couldn't use his planned taxi alibi. He needed a very specific timestamp to anchor the official police investigation to a moment when he was miles away across town, sitting in the back of a commercial cab. So Tommy went to work staging the theatrical set. He pulled Arthur's silver pocket watch from his dead pocket. He deliberately smashed the glass face against the rough edge of the timber pier, jamming the internal metal hands tight at 11:15. Then he tucked the ruined watch back into the dead man's coat, ensuring that any lazy detective who looked at the body would automatically swallow the fake timeline whole. But a dead man's watch stopping in an empty, silent fog doesn't ring any bells. A body lying quietly on a dark pier at 9 o'clock doesn't summon a night watchman. That was where the oil drum came in. I looked down into the rusted depths of the metal container once more. The metal walls acted as a natural amplifier, a giant megaphone facing out across the dark water of the bay. Tommy had wedged a blank pistol cartridge or a heavy firecracker right inside the heart of the scorched matchbook. Then he lit the end of the cigarette, the slow-burning fuse, and dropped the whole rigged contraption down into the empty oil drum before hurrying off to flag down his yellow cab on Union Street. He didn't need to be on the pier when the noise happened. He just needed math and chemistry to do his dirty work for him. The cigarette burned slowly, inch by inch, through the damp night air, exactly like a slow-burning fuse on a stick of dynamite. It smoldered quietly inside the sheltered metal drum, feeding on the stale air until it finally reached the sulfur heads of the matchbook. Pop! A sharp, violent explosion echoed off the rusted metal walls. The blank cartridge went off inside the drum with a crack that mimicked a gunshot or a sudden, desperate struggle. The sound bounced across the water, carrying clearly through the heavy fog until it reached the ears of the night watchman patrolling the adjacent dock. The watchman heard the sharp crack. He heard the echo bouncing off the water. He checked his watch, 11:15 sharp. He came running through the fog toward Pier 19, shouting into the gray mist, and stumbled directly over Arthur Finch's freshly staged body. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculating logistics, a murder executed by clockwork and cigarette smoke. I stood there in the freezing fog, holding the ruined matchbook tightly in my gloved hand. The entire framework of the crime clicked into absolute alignment, every piece locked into its proper groove. Tommy thought he was clever. He thought he had built an airtight alibi that no cop or private eye could ever penetrate. He had his time-stamped cab receipt, his innocent routine, and his nervous, sweating demeanor hidden behind a wall of manufactured coincidence. But he left the matchbook behind. He left the physical evidence of his delayed fuse trick sitting right at the bottom of a rusty oil drum, trusting that the thick dockside fog and Detective Russo's pure laziness would keep it buried forever. I slipped the scorched cardboard back into my trench coat pocket and pulled my collar up against the biting wind. The investigation phase was officially over. I knew who did it, I knew why he did it, and most importantly, I knew exactly how he pulled off the greatest magic trick in Seattle. Now comes the fun part. It was time to spring the trap, drag Tommy Mercer out of his comfortable rooming house, and let him explain his immaculate timing to a man holding a very different kind of receipt. I turned my back on the dark water of Elliott Bay and walked briskly off the pier, leaving the ghosts of Pier 19 behind me in the gray mist. The precinct house on 3rd Avenue smelled like wet wool, stale tobacco, and 30 years of bad life choices. The green paint on the walls was peeling away in dry curls, revealing layers of gray plaster underneath. Overhead, a row of naked fluorescent bulbs buzzed with a steady, migraine-inducing hum that set my teeth on edge. I pushed open the swinging wooden gate that separated the public waiting area from the detective bullpen. The room was loud and chaotic. Typewriters clattered away in the corner like mechanical crickets. Uniformed cops in wrinkled shirts shuffled past carrying paper coffee cups and thick manila folders. Nobody looked at me twice. In a place like this, a rumpled trench coat and a tired expression meant you either belonged here or you were about to be locked up. I walked straight across the linoleum floor and stopped beside Detective Russo's desk. Russo was sitting back in his squeaky swivel chair with his feet propped up on a corner of the scarred wooden desk. His coat was off, his tie was loosened, and he was aggressively chewing on an unlit brown cigar. He was flipping lazily through a stack of paperwork, looking like a man who wanted nothing more than to sign his name and head home to a hot bowl of soup. He heard my footsteps, lowered his feet to the floor with a heavy thud, and glared up at me through a haze of cigarette smoke. "What do you want, Nile?" Russo barked, his raspy voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bullpen. "I thought I told you to stay off my docks. The Finch case is wrapped tighter than a Christmas present. I'm signing the closure forms in the morning." "That's exactly why I'm here, Russo," I said, pulling a wooden chair away from an adjacent desk and sitting down uninvited. I didn't wait for him to offer. I slouched back, resting my hands in my trench coat pockets. "I just wanted to make sure your paperwork is as pristine as your theory. Because if you sign off on a routine mugging, you're going to look like a complete amateur when the truth walks out of the courtroom." Russo narrowed his eyes. He pointed the soggy end of his unlit cigar straight at my nose. "Watch your mouth, Nile," Russo growled, leaning forward over the desk. "I've got a dead body on a wooden pier, a smashed pocket watch stopped at 11:15, and a night watchman who heard the whole damn struggle. It's an open and shut street robbery. What part of that simple arithmetic are you having trouble processing?" "The part where the victim was killed hours before the clock stopped," I said smoothly. Russo froze. He stared at me for 3 long seconds, his thick eyebrows knitting together in a heavy frown. Then he let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded like dry gravel hitting a tin roof. "Oh, Jesus Christ," Russo muttered. rubbing his eyes with a massive square thumb. "You've been spending too much time breathing that salty air down at the bay. What fairy tale are you spinning now, Gumshoe? Did the widow hire you to invent a ghost story so she can squeeze another grand out of the insurance company?" "No ghost stories, Russo," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "Just basic physics. Did you or your crime scene techs take a close look at the empty oil drums sitting right beside the bloodstain on Pier 19? Russo blinked. He dropped his hand from his face. "The trash barrels. Why the hell would we look in a trash barrel? A guy got his head cracked open on the open wood, not inside a garbage can." "That's because you like your investigations nice and tidy," I told him. "You look at the blood, you look at the broken watch, and you stop thinking. But if you take a walk down there right now and check the bottom of that rusty green drum, you'll find a very interesting piece of evidence. A scorched matchbook rigged with a slow-burning cigarette fuse." Russo didn't laugh this time. The cynical amusement vanished from his heavy face, replaced by a cold, suspicious glare. He knew me well enough to know I didn't invent evidence out of thin air. "A matchbook?" Russo repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "What is that supposed to prove?" "It proves that the 11:15 gunshot the night watchman heard wasn't a struggle," I said. "It was a delayed fuse blank, going off inside a metal amplifier to fake a timestamped. The murder happened hours earlier. The smashed watch was just a cheap theatrical prop planted to match a future moment in time." Russo stared at me hard. He chewed slowly on his unlit cigar, his brain visibly grinding through the logistics of the idea. He was lazy, but he wasn't completely stupid. He knew a rigged timestamp blew his entire closure report right out of the water. "If the murder happened earlier," Russo said slowly, his voice dropping into a dangerous register, "then the alibi for the 11:15 timestamped belongs to the only guy in Seattle who needed an ironclad excuse for that exact minute." I finished for him. Russo sat up straight. He dropped his feet flat onto the floor, planted his massive hands on the wooden desk, and leaned across toward me. "Tommy Mercer," Russo said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Tommy Mercer," I confirmed. "The victim's best friend and union office partner. The guy who's been sweating overcooked books and missing ledger pages. The guy who just happened to pull a pristine time-stamped yellow cab receipt out of his pocket at 11:15 sharp to prove he was miles away from the docks." Russo let out a low whistle through his teeth. He reached out, grabbed his heavy ceramic coffee mug, and took a bitter sip of the cold black sludge inside. He looked down at the pile of closure forms sitting on his desk, then backed up at me. "A cab receipt," Russo muttered, shaking his head. "The guy handed me an alibi before I even finished asking where he was drinking last night. It was too clean. I should have smelled the rat right then and there." "You were too busy wanting to go home, Russo," I said. Russo didn't bother to deny it. He reached out, picked up a heavy red grease pencil from his desk tray, and drew a massive jagged X right across the front page of his closure report. The red mark looked like a slash of fresh blood across the white paper. "If Tommy rigged a delayed fuse to buy himself an alibi ride across town," Russo said, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, "then he didn't just commit a robbery gone wrong. He planned a cold-blooded execution, and he made a fool out of my entire precinct." "That's a very accurate summary of the situation," I said. Russo stood up from his squeaky chair. He towered over the desk, his massive shoulders nearly hitting the low overhead light fixture. He reached down, grabbed his dark wool overcoat off the back of the chair, and shoved his arms into the sleeves with sharp, impatient jerks. "Well, we can't have a dock worker making my detectives look like a bunch of county jail guards," Russo barked, pulling a heavy steel snub-nosed revolver from his holster and checking the cylinder with a sharp click. "Get your coat on, Nile." "Where are we going?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We're going to pay a little social visit to room 2B on 2nd Avenue, Russo said, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corner of his thick mouth. "We're going to take Tommy Mercer out for a nice quiet ride downtown. And this time, we're going to check his watch to see if it's telling the right time." I rose slowly from the wooden chair. I pulled my rumpled trench coat tight around my shoulders, feeling the comforting weight of the scorched matchbook resting safely in my pocket. "Lead the way, detective," I told him. "Let's go hail a ghost." The interrogation room at the precinct on 3rd Avenue was a concrete box designed by someone who hated human beings. The walls were painted a sickly shade of institutional green that had long since started to peel near the floorboards. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed black cord, swinging with a faint hypnotic motion in the stagnant air. In the center of the room sat a heavy steel table bolted directly to the concrete floor, flanked by 2 matching metal chairs. Tommy Mercer sat in one of those chairs. He didn't look like the nervous, arrogant clerk I had visited in his rooming house earlier. His slicked back hair was coming undone, a stray lock falling limply across his pale forehead. His white shirt was wrinkled at the collar, and his breathing was shallow and fast. But his left wrist was still proudly adorned with the heavy gold wristwatch, the metal casing catching the harsh glare of the overhead bulb and flashing a blinding yellow spark every time he shifted his weight. Detective Russo kicked the heavy metal door behind us. The sound echoed off the bare concrete like a gunshot in a tunnel. I walked over and sat down at the steel table directly across from Tommy. Russo didn't sit. He stood right behind me, his massive frame blocking the only exit, crossing his thick arms over his chest like a statue carved out of bad temper and cheap cigars. Tommy looked up at us, his dark eyes darting frantically from Russo's heavy face to mine. He tried to force a defensive, indignant scowl onto his pale features, but his mouth trembled at the corners. "What is the meaning of this?" Tommy demanded, his voice pitching up into an unnatural, nervous squeak. "I demand to know why I was dragged out of my bed in the middle of the night by a couple of thugs with a badge. I told you everything I know. I have an alibi. I have a receipt." "Yeah, Tommy, that's the funny thing about receipts in this town," I said softly. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the thick, heavily scorched cardboard matchbook I had retrieved from the dockside oil drum, and slid it slowly across the cold steel table. "They only prove where you were sitting when the ink hit the paper. They don't explain how a dead man's pocket watch managed to tell a lie." Tommy stared at the blackened, warped matchbook resting on the metal table. For a split second, every muscle in his body went completely rigid. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the exact shade of old skim milk. He swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. But then he forced himself to blink, pasting a layer of frantic confusion over his panic. "What is that trash?" Tommy snapped, pulling his hands back off the table and pressing them flat against his knees. "I don't know anything about matches. I don't smoke. What kind of game are you playing, Nile?" "It's not a game, Tommy," I said, leaning forward across the table, bringing my face close enough for him to smell the stale coffee and cigarette smoke clinging to my coat. "It's a very simple piece of engineering. You brought Arthur Finch to Pier 19 before 11 o'clock tonight. You argued over the missing union funds in the ledger, the thousands of dollars you were stealing to cover your heavy gambling debts at the tracks. When Arthur threatened to take the books straight to Silas Croft, you didn't argue back. You picked up a heavy steel cargo hook and cracked his skull open." "That's a lie," Tommy shouted, slamming his palms down onto the metal table with a sharp bang. "I was across town. I was at a movie. I took a cab. Check my receipt. The timestamp says 11:15. "The timestamp is the exact reason you're sitting in this concrete box, Tommy," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, flat register that cut right through his shouting. "Because a murder didn't happen at 11:15. Arthur Finch was dead hours before that. You staged the entire scene like a cheap Broadway play to match your transit schedule." Russo leaned in from behind my shoulder, his raspy voice rumbling like a slow earthquake. "You pulled Arthur's silver pocket watch out of his coat, Tommy," Russo growled, resting his heavy hands on the back of my chair. "You smashed the glass face against the rough timber of the pier to jam the hands tight at 11:15. You wanted every cop in Seattle to look at the dial and swallow your fake timeline whole." "I didn't touch his watch," Tommy yelled, his voice cracking violently. "You can't prove a damn thing. The cab driver picked me up on Union Street at 11:15. He dropped me at my rooming house at 11:30. The paper receipt proves it." "The receipt proves you were sitting in the back of a yellow cab at 11:15, Tommy," I agreed, tapping my index finger against the scorched matchbook on the table. "Which is exactly why you couldn't possibly be on the pier swinging a cargo hook at that exact second. But a dead man can't yell for help to bring a night watchman running out of the fog, so you had to build a clockwork trigger." Tommy stopped shouting. He froze. His dark eyes locked onto the matchbook on the table, paralyzed. "You wrapped a lit cigarette tightly around this cardboard matchbook," I explained, breaking down the mechanics piece by piece for the record. You wedged a blank cartridge or a heavy firecracker right inside the center. Then you dropped the whole rigged contraption down into the bottom of an empty metal oil drum right beside the body. You lit the cigarette fuse and walked away to catch your cab. I leaned back in my metal chair, watching him sweat under the harsh light. The cigarette burned slowly through the damp night air, I continued. Inch by inch, exactly like a time delay fuse. It smoldered quietly inside the metal drum, acting like a giant amplifier facing out across the water. And right at 11:15 sharp, while you were sitting comfortably across town making sure the cab driver looked at his watch, the fire reached the matches. Pop! A sharp explosion echoed across the bay. The night watchman heard what he thought was a struggle, ran through the fog, and stumbled over a body you had finished hours earlier. The interrogation room fell dead silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the overhead fluorescent bulb and the frantic, shallow panting of the man sitting across the table. Tommy Mercer looked like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse into a pile of ash. His alibi wasn't a shield anymore. It was the very rope hanging him from the rafters. "It's a masterpiece of logistics, Tommy," I said quietly. "A murder executed by cigarette smoke and arithmetic. But you made one fatal mistake." Tommy's lips parted slightly. He didn't ask what the mistake was. He already knew. "You left the matchbook behind," Russo finished for me, a grim, satisfied grin spreading across his heavy face. "You left your little mechanical clock sitting at the bottom of a rusty trash drum, trusting that the fog would hide your tracks forever. Well, the fog cleared, Tommy. And your time just ran out." Tommy stared at the steel table. His shoulders slumped inward, as if a heavy iron weight had suddenly been dropped onto his back. The arrogant clerk, the nervous embezzler, the mastermind of the dockside delay fuse vanished all at once, leaving behind only a scared, cornered rat trapped in a concrete box. The silence in the interrogation room stretched so long it felt heavy enough to choke on. The naked bulb overhead gave off a sickly, vibrating hum that drilled straight into the base of my skull. Tommy Mercer didn't look at the scorched matchbook anymore. He didn't look at Detective Russo standing like a brick wall behind my chair. He slowly raised his right hand and stared down at the heavy gold wristwatch strapped tightly to his wrist. The second hand ticked away in a steady, relentless circle. Red gold, expensive glass, pristine metal. It looked entirely out of place in a concrete box, smelling of old sweat and disinfectant. Slowly, the tension drained from Tommy's posture. The frantic, defensive panic that had kept him upright dissolved into something hollow and pathetic. His shoulders slumped forward until his forehead was only inches from the cold steel table. "You guys don't understand," Tommy whispered. His voice was no higher than a dry rustle of dead leaves. It didn't sound like a confession yet. It sounded like a man talking aloud to an empty room. "You think it's easy working down at those docks? You think a number cruncher gets rich pushing ink all day long?" "Nobody said anything about getting rich, Tommy," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and entirely neutral. "We were talking about a dead man with a crushed skull on Pier 19. Tommy let out a dry, rattling laugh. It was a miserable sound, completely devoid of humor. He rubbed his face with both shaking hands, smearing sweat and gray dirt across his pale skin. "Arthur wasn't supposed to die," Tommy muttered, his fingers clawing slightly at his cheeks. "He was my friend. We ate lunch together every Tuesday down at the diner. We talked about baseball, about the weather, about getting out of this damp gray hole of a city. Friends usually don't beat each other's heads in with heavy steel cargo hooks." Russo rumbled from behind me, his tone thick with disgust. "That's generally considered poor etiquette among pals." "I didn't plan to kill him," Tommy snapped, his head jerking up. His bloodshot eyes flashed with a sudden, desperate flare of anger. "It was an accident. A terrible, stupid accident." "A delayed fuse matchbook inside an oil drum is a funny way to spell accident, Tommy," I noted. Tommy slumped back down, resting his elbows on the steel table and burying his face in his trembling hands. "The gambling debts were real," he confessed, the words tumbling out of him fast now, spilling over each other like loose gravel down a chute. "I got in deep with the wrong crowd on Yesler Way. Card games, horse bets, ugly men in expensive suits who didn't care about excuses. They told me if I didn't pay up to $5,000 by the end of the month, they were going to break my fingers one by one. I couldn't write stories with broken hands, Nile. I couldn't survive. So you started dipping your fingers into the union ledger, I said. It was just a temporary loan, Tommy pleaded, looking at me with wide, pathetic eyes. Just a few hundred here, 1,000 there. Silas Croft didn't even notice. The funds were massive. I figured I'd hit a lucky streak at the track, put the money back, and nobody would ever be the wiser. I was going to pay it all back before the annual audit. Except you didn't hit a lucky streak, I said. Gambling debts never sleep, Tommy. They just multiply like stray cats. They multiplied, all right, Tommy whispered, his voice cracking. And Arthur found the missing pages. He didn't yell. He didn't immediately threaten to call the police. He just sat at his desk, staring at those altered columns with those sad, narrow little eyes of his. He told me he was going to take the books straight to Silas Croft in the morning. He told me he was sorry, but he had a wife to protect and a reputation to maintain. Do you know what Croft does to guys who steal from the Union Treasury, Nile? Croft doesn't just fire them. He leaves them floating face down in Elliott Bay with concrete galoshes. Tommy swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively as he relived the terror that had driven him to murder. Arthur backed me into a corner, Tommy said, his voice dropping into a desperate justification. He left me no choice. It was his life or mine. I asked him to meet me down at Pier 19 late at night so we could talk it over quietly. I brought the cargo hook from the loading bay just in case he wouldn't listen to reason. When he told me he wouldn't cover for me, when he turned his back to walk away, I swung it. Just one hard swing. I didn't mean to hit him that hard. I swear to God I didn't want him to die. The room fell quiet again. The confession hung in the stagnant air like a foul mist. It wasn't a grand conspiracy by criminal masterminds. It wasn't an international smuggling ring or a political assassination. It was just the oldest, ugliest motive in human history. Greed, panic, and the desperate, cowardly self-preservation of a weak man caught with his hand deep in the cookie jar. And the watch, Tommy? Russo asked, his voice like grinding stones. The smashed pocket watch and the cigarette fuse in the oil drum? You didn't come up with that staging by accident. Tommy lowered his gaze to the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He traced the rim of the metal casing with a stained fingernail. I watched too many late-night crime serials on the radio, Tommy muttered, a bitter, self-loathing smirk touching the corner of his mouth. I knew I needed an alibi. I knew the cops would look at the time of death first, so I smashed his watch against the wood to set the clock. I rigged the matchbook and the cigarette inside the oil drum so the noise would bring the watchman running right at 11:15. Then I walked 3 blocks, caught a yellow cab, and handed the driver a time-stamped receipt right as my little mechanical trap went off across town. It was brilliant. It was foolproof. Except for the part where you forgot that physics leaves fingerprints just like skin does, I said. Tommy didn't answer. He let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to empty the last remaining ounce of fight out of his body. He slumped back against the metal chair, his head lolling sideways toward the stained green wall. He looked 10 years older than he had when I knocked on his apartment door earlier that night. Detective Russo stepped forward from behind my chair. He reached out and grabbed Tommy by the shoulder, hauling him up out of the metal seat with a sharp, practiced jerk. A pair of heavy steel handcuffs flashed in the harsh light of the overhead bulb, dangling from Russo's thick fingers. "All right, Tommy's over," Russo barked, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You played a high-stakes hand, and you folded right at the river. Let's take a walk to the booking desk. We've got a very nice, warm jail cell waiting for a playwright of your specific talents." Tommy didn't resist. He didn't yell or demand a lawyer or try to run. He just let his arms fall forward, staring blankly at the cold metal links as Russo snapped them securely around his wrists. The heavy gold wristwatch on his left arm caught the light one last time, ticking away the seconds in a quiet, indifferent rhythm as the killer was hauled out of the interrogation room and into the long gray shadow of justice. The rain started up again just as I pushed my way out of the precinct doors and stepped back onto 3rd Avenue. It wasn't a clean, honest downpour. It was that fine, miserable Seattle drizzle that doesn't fall so much as hang suspended in the air, waiting to soak straight through your trench coat and settle directly into your bones. The case was officially buttoned up. Tommy Mercer was locked securely in a county holding cell, waiting for a judge who would hand down a very long, very unglamorous sentence for a murder built on stolen ledger pages and cigarette smoke. Detective Russo had his signed confession. The Union books were back in Silas Croft's heavy safe, and Eleanor Finch was already down at the insurance agency with her paperwork in hand, ready to collect every last cent of Arthur's payout. Everyone got exactly what they wanted from the deal, which usually meant nobody walked away clean. I walked 3 blocks through the shimmering gray drizzle until I reached the familiar red neon glow of the all-night diner. The door chimed softly as I pushed it open. The interior smelled exactly as it always did: stale coffee grounds, fried onions, and a heavy dose of industrial floor bleach. The red electric sign in the window was still casting a bleeding pink light across the wet linoleum. I walked straight to my usual corner booth and slid into the vinyl seat. I didn't take off my coat. I just pulled the collar down and let the damp chill evaporate slowly into the warm air of the joint. A second later, Murphy appeared beside the table. She carried the glass coffee pot like it was a weapon. Her hair was still locked up tight in its invisible net, and her apron still bore that permanent stain near the front pocket that looked suspiciously like cherry pie filling. She didn't ask what I wanted. She just poured a steaming stream of the dark, bitter mud into my heavy ceramic mug until it threatened to spill over the brim. I heard on the morning radio broadcast that Detective Russo finally cracked that dockside murder, Murphy said, her voice completely flat. She set the glass pot down on the formica with a dull thud. They said the victim's best friend tried to fake an alibi with a smashed watch and a delayed fuse bomb in a trash barrel. Sounds like a lot of fancy nonsense for a guy who just wanted a paycheck. It wasn't a bomb, Murphy, I corrected her, picking up the heavy mug and letting the heat soak into my stiff fingers. Just a blank cartridge and a slow-burning cigarette, a very neat little magic trick. Too bad the audience included a guy in a rumpled trench coat who hates being lied to. Murphy pulled a small gray rag from her belt and wiped down an already spotless section of the table right beside my elbow. "Well, you solved it, Nile," Murphy said, her tone devoid of any real praise or affection. "Does that mean the widow paid you your full fee?" "She paid me," I said, taking a slow, cautious sip of the bitter coffee. It burned my throat, but it tasted remarkably like victory. Enough to cover my back rent for another month, buy a few packs of cigarettes, and keep me sitting in this exact booth for a few more cups of your world-famous mud. "Don't get used to it, honey," Murphy said, turning away with her gray rag in hand. "Rent goes up on the 1st of the month. Contemplation doesn't pay the property tax." She walked back behind the counter, leaving me alone with my coffee and the quiet hum of the diner's old electric refrigerator. To clear up any lingering mystery in the case file, Arthur Finch was murdered by his co-worker Tommy Mercer over thousands of dollars in stolen union funds used to cover heavy gambling debts. Tommy crushed Arthur's skull with a cargo hook at Pier 19 hours before 11:15, then smashed Arthur's pocket watch to fake the time of death, and rigged a slow-burning cigarette inside an empty oil drum to trigger a blank cartridge, creating the illusion of a struggle while he established an airtight taxicab alibi across town. It was a flawless piece of engineering designed to deceive the police, but it completely fell apart the moment the matchbook evidence pointed straight to the truth. I looked out the grease-smudged window. The Seattle fog was finally starting to lift, replaced by the pale, watery gray light of an early morning breaking over Elliott Bay. The cargo ships were beginning to move out toward the open water, their deep horns echoing softly across the damp streets. It was just another damp morning in a city built on rain, bad luck, and secrets that never quite stayed buried in the mud. I finished the last bitter drop of my coffee, pulled a single coin from my pocket to cover the tab, and pushed my way back out into the gray dawn. That wraps another case file from the dark side of Seattle. Drop a comment below and let me know. Did Tommy's clever cigarette fuse alibi fool you at first, or did you spot the fake timestamp right from the start? And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery walking through my door. Until then, keep your doors bolted and your eyes open in the fog.